Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a changemaker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon-neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Staying within the Paris Climate Accord's 1.5 degrees Celsius target, at which potentially devastating climate change will occur, requires ending deforestation before 2030. But as of 2020, the world is still losing about 38,600 square miles of forest annually. These vast but rapidly shrinking forest ecosystems are the lungs of the planet, essential to climate stability. Not only do they generate oxygen and transfer water to the atmosphere, tropical forests are also home to 80% of the world's known species and could be a treasure trove of biological and medical discoveries, but only if we keep them intact. Incentives for keeping forests intact and to begin the restoration of forests already decimated by logging and lost to farmland are essential to changing the trajectory of the climate crisis. Our guest today is Allan Traicoff, Chief Commercial Officer at Emergent, a nonprofit that creates incentives for and connects businesses to natural climate solutions in countries that have decided to protect their tropical rainforests. Emergent focuses on identifying high-quality carbon credits, which we'll talk about during the interview. Working with the LEAF Coalition, a group of 20 global companies, the United Kingdom, Norway, and the United States, Emergent has facilitated more than $1 billion in emissions reduction demand funding to date. LEAF also announced at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, that it had signed initial agreements to support deforestation projects in 5 countries in Central America and Asia. Preserving standing rainforests is the most efficient way to capture carbon, but Emergent also works with reforestation programs to restore land to its natural state. There's a lot to discuss, more than we can possibly cover today, so let's start exploring the potential for forest preservation and recovery. You can learn more about Emergent at emergentclimate.com. Emergent Climate is one word, no space, no dash, emergentclimate.com. Welcome to the show, Allan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for joining us. And, I want to start off by asking about the founding of Emergent. You have a mission to bring corporate money to preserving forests. What are the key issues that you're telling companies they need to understand about forests' role in the environment and the impact of destroying them for profit?
Well, it's interesting because you have companies that are directly connected to land use change, and we refer to those as flag companies, forest, land use, and agriculture companies. These companies are directly and indirectly responsible for roughly 27% of worldwide carbon emissions. And then you have companies that are not in the flag sector and see themselves as distant from. But it's all connected, Mitch. And this is what I explain to companies as they're pondering their entrance into the jurisdictional REDD+ space, which we'll describe what jurisdictional REDD+ means in another question. But ultimately, I think part of my job, my team's job, is in helping companies to see that they have a direct connection to forests, because forests play an integral role in helping to prevent climate change, further climate change, not to mention biodiversity and a whole host of other benefits. So I think that companies, whether or not they are directly or indirectly responsible for destruction of forests, can play a role either within their internal value chain or in what we call beyond value chain mitigation.
Now, you were part of the formation of the LEAF Coalition, which was announced at President Biden's Leaders Summit on the climate in 2021. And you have 20 members, global companies, plus 3 governments, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway. Tell us about the evolution of LEAF and what kind of commitments a company has to make to join LEAF.
Right. So at COP27, we made some very interesting announcements in terms of demand side participants. So we grew the coalition to 26 participants, and we doubled private sector ambition. So we now have a total of $1.5 billion in forward purchase commitments of jurisdictional RED Plus credits. And we also added the country of Korea to the coalition as our first Asian government. And Korea has a very interesting restoration story, and it stands poised to influence other countries who are on their halting deforestation journey. So I think it's important to reflect on the amount of progress in very, very little time. We've also signed a number of MOUs and LOIs with forest country governments themselves. So the pace at which we are getting to formal transactions is accelerating, which is positive for everybody. Now, your second part of your question was, what do companies need to do in order to get involved?
Right.
And that is, they must demonstrate against the LEAF buyers criteria that they are focused on their internal value chain emissions in a way that keeps them on a 1.5 degree trajectory. And we simply cannot work with a company who isn't focused on a 1.5 degree trajectory. And so that means they have to publicly commit to setting a science-based target. They have to have a net zero target covering all three scopes, and they must join the UN Race to Zero if they're not already part of UN Race to Zero. And I was on a panel last week, and one of the sort of main protagonists of the show was asking me, well, doesn't that seem kind of foolish that you're turning away companies who want to get involved in protecting the world's remaining rainforests? And my response was, we seem to be off to a great start already by companies who are doing the right thing. And second of all, deforestation globally is just 10% of the problem. There's the other 90% of the global carbon budget that's going to be consumed if we aren't somehow working in lockstep to do all of it. There isn't an option where you just focus on forests, but you don't decrease your internal combustion emissions.
Well, and as you said at the outset, it's a systematic problem. Systemically, we need to make comprehensive changes, and just focusing on the one aspect is the mistake. But so what I hear you saying is that LEAF membership is something that if the company has made that commitment, they're probably pretty serious about it. Is that something you would recommend customers thinking about what businesses they support look for as a form of confirmation of their commitment?
Absolutely. I think, you have, we call these high ambition net zero companies. And the high ambition part means that they're thinking squarely in beyond value chain mitigation, in addition to internal value chain mitigation. And I'd say there's even a next stage where you see companies thinking about nature positive. So separating the carbon credit from a carbon related claim, right? So let's separate carbon neutral type claims. You have lots of companies that are allergic to stepping into, carbon neutrality type claims, but you have more and more companies conveying a sense of optimism or openness to nature related claims. And I happen to think that there's a lot that can be done utilizing the carbon credit and its infrastructure as a means to do both of those things. So I would like to see that in 2023, we see, an outpouring of commitments from companies that previously have been on the sidelines. They get involved in beyond value chain mitigation because they understand the risks to nature, and they understand that you can use the carbon crediting system and infrastructure to do that.
Well, you're hitting on an important point, which is carbon neutrality is really only the first step. After that, there's the nature positive commitment that we have to make to actually reduce the CO2 emissions that are already in the atmosphere. Now, what is the LEAF Coalition's guidance to companies about the best mix of forest preservation, carbon reduction, and other efforts that they might take to end the climate crisis? What do you say when they ask?
So, Mitch, I'm going to revisit the last sentence of your previous statement, and it ties in nicely into the question you just asked, and that's drawing carbon down from the atmosphere is actually not nature positive. That is called carbon removals. And you have some companies out there who today only buy carbon removals. They claim to be on a carbon negative journey where they've already become net zero, and now they're looking at removing carbon across their entire company's history, the company's footprint, like a
Microsoft, for
Microsoft,
instance, has made this commitment. Yeah.
For instance. So I think in one regard, what Microsoft has been able to do is nothing short of outstanding, right? And kudos to Microsoft for setting a benchmark for where all companies should be heading. On the other hand, I think there's a trick that's being missed, and that's that there is a global carbon budget. This is a numbers-based challenge, and focusing solely on removals does not address the full scope of the challenge. The analogy I'd like to use, and I'm sure you've heard it, is the bathtub analogy. You walk into your bathroom, the bathtub is overflowing. And what is your first reaction? Do you turn off the two spigots, right? Or do you reach into the water and you pull out the plug? And removals is like pulling out the plug, but you leave the water running on full.
Right.
I think our natural inclination is to turn off the water first, and then pull out the plug.
Generally, that's absolutely the case. Most people would say stop the source pollution rather than worry about removing it. But then that comes back to what is the right guidance for a company with regard to how to use the mix of options available.
Yeah. So there are three types of credits that the beef jurisdiction has on offer, right? The first and most important is the emissions reduction credit. So where deforestation has been happening, stop it. Buy an emissions reductions credit, and the international and local governmental bodies and communities that support them will work together to foster a halting of that deforestation. So that is an emissions reductions credit.
Okay, so turn down the faucet.
Exactly, turn down the faucet. And then the second type of credit is a removals credit. So if a country or a state has demonstrated that it has slowly been reducing the levels of deforestation, then it is permitted to go and plant a bunch of trees, and hopefully biodiversity driven planting strategies, right?
Right.
So those are called removals, and then there's a third type of credit which has some controversy associated with it. It's called the high forest low deforestation credit, and this is where a country or a state is being compensated for not having yet started cutting down their trees, but they might be on the precipice of doing so. So reward them for preserving the carbon in their canopy cover and in their soils before they go about allowing for the private sector to come in and remove those trees.
So, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has a vast tropical rainforest, could actually monetize its rainforest with these credits.
Exactly.
So that we can preserve it.
Exactly. Guyana is another good example. Guyana, DRC, there's a number of states in Brazil that qualify as HFLD. And coming back to nature positive, if you're a nature positive company, you don't really want credits per se. You don't want a carbon neutrality claim. Supporting HFLD countries and states is the ideal way of realizing your nature positive ambition. You're protecting biodiversity. You're helping with evapotranspiration. You're protecting IPLCs. The list goes on in association with HFLDs.
Just for our listeners, IPLC stands for?
Oh, I'm sorry. Indigenous people and local communities.
Okay, so which is, of course, another critical component of understanding how we're changing our relationship with the forest is the people who live there need to be provided a way to continue to prosper.
They do. And frankly, we need them.
Yeah.
We need them because they are the best stewards of the forests. And we've done a lot of really great things with science over the years, but indigenous people and local communities have been tending to the forest for millennia, and there's no better replacement. So we should absolutely be supporting IPLC communities.
Okay, so this leads to the the technical part of the conversation, and you referred to the REDD+ credits earlier. So REDD+ stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. It's an initiative established by the UN in 2005. Can you explain briefly why countries play such an important role in establishing what you are using, which is a jurisdictional REDD credit? In other words, related to a specific geography.
Absolutely. So I'll first introduce a project-based credit, because this is what the entire voluntary carbon market has been purchasing since around 2006, 2005. The VCM, the voluntary carbon market, sees renewable energy credits traded. They see cook stoves, forestry related or REDD+ related, nature-based solutions. These have historically been produced by project developers and then sold on to, these credits have been sold on to corporates via intermediaries, whether those are brokers or principals, aggregators. The entire voluntary carbon market has been project-based credits up until 2 weeks ago, when the very first jurisdictional REDD+ transaction took place with the country of Guyana and a large oil and gas company called Hess. Emergent, we are the nonprofit coordinator of the Leaf Coalition. Our sole purpose is to help foster a healthy and successful voluntary carbon market for jurisdictional REDD+. And so jurisdictional REDD+, what that does and where it's different than project is it takes the approach of protecting, conserving, or restoring small plots of land, call it 1,000 acres, 10,000 acres, and it blows that out to really large plots of land, like entire states or entire countries. The smallest jurisdiction would be 2.5 million hectares, which is roughly just under 4 million acres, and can go all the way up to 100 million hectares. So jurisdictional REDD+ is not only bigger, but it builds upon a legacy of countries working with their communities to solve tropical deforestation over many years. REDD+ as an approach was born out of UN negotiations many years ago in the early 2000s. And countries have since that time been preparing for a day when private sector finance would be able to compensate them for their efforts. And on the run up until now, you've had numerous initiatives like Forest Carbon Partnership Facility run by the World Bank, many types of bilateral transactions, results-based transactions take place. But those have all been in the government-to-government realm. And you've never had the private sector come in to pick up the pace. And that's what's happening right now. And
so essentially a REDD+ credit or a jurisdictional REDD+ credit is a declaration that this land is now off limits with regard to extraction? Or how would you characterize the continued relationship of the place with the economic opportunity to exploit the forest in some way?
It's a bit more mathematical than that. So what happens, at least with the ART trees standard, the architecture for REDD+ transactions trees standard, it's not the only jurisdictional REDD+ standard in the world. There is another one that Vera is working on, but ART trees is the one that the Leaf Coalition has chosen to leverage. And so what the ART trees standard does is it looks 5 years into the past, and it takes an average of the amount of deforestation and emissions released associated with that land use clearing to establish a scientific baseline, right? Different than the project approach. The project is usually built on a hypothetical of what could happen, right? Whereas the jurisdictional REDD+ approach says over this entire landscape, the entire state or country, what's been the average rate of emissions? And then it says, okay, this is your baseline, X. if you would like to be remunerated for reducing your levels of deforestation, you need to bring down your levels of deforestation against that baseline. And so there's no sort of on-off switch or requirement that all deforestation is halted. What there is an incentive to accelerate and intensify the levels of halting of deforestation. And that's what LEAF brings. We bring the demand. We bring the money to the table. It's there for you if you're able to bring down your levels of deforestation. I think it would be, I think it would be unlikely that any country would be able to absolutely, from one day to the next, completely cut off deforestation.
Sure. Well, it's really important to understand that what you've put in place is that incentive. It's always going to be up to the country to make the steps that are going to earn the compensation that is involved.
Correct.
Let's take a quick commercial break. This is a fascinating conversation. We'll be right back. We're back to continue our conversation with Allan Traicoff. He is the Chief Commercial Officer at Emergent, which is a nonprofit that has created incentives around deforestation programs. And we were just talking about the jurisdictional RED Plus credit, which stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. So, Allan, obviously, this is a big step change in terms of the level of commitment, both that the private sector and governments are making to preserving and reforesting their lands. How should consumers assess both these claims and any social impacts, like we were talking about with regard to the indigenous people living in these forests, when making a decision about what companies to buy from? Because essentially our only option is to vote with our dollars. How should we vote?
I think, Mitch, that it's important that we bifurcate the question. I think you have companies and the decisions that they need to make around what kinds of beyond value chain mitigation they choose to endorse. And then you have consumers and the way that they interact with the companies with whom they buy products and services from. So from a company's perspective, I think whether they first need to decide, are they going to do beyond value chain mitigation? Yes or no? And if they are, what is the portfolio of options that they have in front of them? And it usually always is going to be a portfolio combined of, different social. You have a combination of social responsibility initiatives that are more philanthropic in nature. You have energy transition initiatives, and then you have, and often you have RED Plus or forestry related initiatives. And in the case of forestry, a company needs to decide, do I want to stick doing just small projects, or am I ready to go with something that is more of a systemic change in nature kind of initiative? And that's what jurisdictional RED Plus is. Okay. The incentives are inciting that jurisdictional governments think about innovative ways that they work with their communities and private sectors to reduce emissions across a very, very large scale in a very small amount of time. But I think if I'm a company, I'm thinking about, well, what's the history with the particular jurisdiction or country that I'm looking at? What kinds of finance have they received previously? What kinds of outcomes have they received? Can they articulate the indigenous community support that is or will be provided? Can they articulate what kinds of biodiversity protections and outcomes can be expected? And what's the overall confidence that I would have as a company that I'll actually be able to source my credits from that jurisdiction? So a lot of this framed in terms of due diligence. Right. And a company would do that anyways. So that's the company side of the equation. I think on the consumer side of the equation, I would venture to say that more and more consumers are going to be taking into account the social equity of a company, which will most certainly include environmental factors amongst others, as they make buying decisions over time. And I think those companies that can incorporate not just a carbon neutrality statement into their sort of strategic narrative will do well. But I think those that can articulate co-benefits beyond carbon are going to be the ones that are probably best understood, especially by millennials who understand that systemic change is required. They're the ones that are going to carry the burden of 1.5 degrees or not, more than you or I will.
Sure.
And so I think that, consumers should be focused on the companies I'm doing business with. Are they focused on their own internal value chain emissions? Do they have a plan? Did they sign up to the Paris Accord? Yes or no? Like if they don't have a science-based target, then they're not signed up to the Paris Accord. And I think more and more consumers will take note of that. And then are they a global steward? Are they a responsible global steward and helping to solve the tough challenges beyond just their value chain? I think, to simplify it, I think that the consumers will look for, what are the companies I'm doing business with? What are they doing in their value chain and beyond their value chain? And can I relate to that? Can I relate to it in terms of people, biodiversity, nature, conservation, et cetera?
Well, and so I think this is where I'm really trying to get to is what should they look for? Is it the LEAF designation? Is it the JRED naming? How would they do their due diligence on the companies? Is really the question. And so, for instance, do companies that join LEAF have their internal carbon budgets set, and they're committed to stay within those carbon budgets? Is that the kind of level of commitment we're talking about when we would examine how we spend our money and who we support in terms of their impact on the environment?
I understand your question better now. So I think it's two things. It's does the company have a plan, and are they sticking to that? Are they delivering against their plan?
How should that be disclosed?
Companies do that as part of their annual reporting regimen. They'll report to the Carbon Disclosure Project. They'll make their annual sustainability reports available publicly. There are, new forms of disclosure requirements coming online, TCFD, TNFD. How savvy is the consumer in terms of being able to decipher that information? Good question. I think most of the time it'll come down to, did I see something negative in the press about a company that I've been dealing with or I'm thinking about dealing with? Which brings me on to my second point. And that is, if a company is going to find its way into a negative press piece, it's usually because they were associated with a project that was either double counted or had a baseline that made no sense, or was found to be actually hurting IPLC communities versus helping them, or simply did not do or did not produce the co-benefits or UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, outcomes that it was, broadcasting was going to do. And so I think whether it's a jurisdictional credit or project credit, integrity is everything. And I wouldn't expect that an average consumer is going to know what the LEAF Coalition is, but they'll certainly be able to decipher if the integrity of a company's association has somehow faltered or been brought into question.
I agree about where you're going. The reason I'm kind of drilling down on this is our listeners are trying to exercise that level of discretion in where their money goes. And so how do you advise the companies that you work with to use phrases like carbon neutral and net zero when making those sustainability commitments or reporting their progress, which particularly here, in the States with the current SEC's proposal is about disclosing risk, but not necessarily disclosing commitments and progress. So it still feels to me like we're talking about a gauzy interface that is not very well defined for people who want to decide to be on the right side of history with the right companies and government.
Understood. Well, I think there's two levels to the question, Mitch. I think you've got what is it about LEAF exactly that companies would or would not be saying that might give consumers a sense of the levels of commitment. And then you've got sort of much deeper, broader discussion around how are companies behaving? Are they are they green hushing Are they greenwashing?
Right.
And that's a much broader topic. I think we'd need a whole other interview set up with probably another couple people to explore that one.
Well, and as I said in the introduction, this is only scraping the surface. So I hope we have that conversation.
Happy to, Mitch. Happy to. Look, the way that companies, I anticipate the way that companies will talk about their association with Leaf will be in the context of this is the highest integrity manner in which we as a company can get involved in tropical forest conservation and restoration, because it is acting at a systemic change level that has never before been seen. The private sector has never been able to get involved in the way that we're doing it, right? So we are pioneers in a way because we believe this is the right thing to do. And yes, there's risk involved in it, but the payoff is worth that risk, and that's why we're doing it. And we as a company feel very confident about the carbon impacts that these outcomes will be able to claim in terms of the scale and the pace. And the fact that the Archies standard has the Cancun safeguards built into them, which essentially says, thou shalt not be issued a credit if you cannot prove that you've done broad stakeholder engagement and that you have a fair benefit sharing plan that sees those proceeds filter out to the communities that actually took part in creating those emissions reductions. And lastly, beyond things like the avoidance of double counting and the avoidance of leakage, which means I stop doing deforestation in this part of the state, but I just go down the street and I do it over there, right?
Right.
The J-RED credit helps to prevent that happens because the jurisdiction is incentivized to look at the whole landscape and not just part of it. Lastly, one more thing I'll say, and that is LEAF as an initiative requires that proceeds that flow into a state or country must go via a financial intermediary and not via the state or country government. And that's because a third party, neutral third party, is best placed to ensure that the fair benefit sharing plan that I mentioned is actually realized.
Okay, so you're auditing for compliance with a fair distribution of the resources and benefits of the credits as well.
Correct. The funding that LEAF provides has to be reinvested in a country or a state's sustainable development goals. It cannot be towards purchasing something that cannot claim to enable a sustainable transition.
So this leads me to the other side of the question, which is there are going to be a lot of changes in the way that we manage forests and that we achieve the recovery of a vibrant environment. That means there's going to be a lot of new jobs. But what do those jobs look like when you think about the forestry practices that you discuss both with companies and with countries? Does the world just need more forest rangers, or is there a wide range of new jobs emerging to support biodiversity, forest health, and how to discover biological compounds sustainably in that environment without destroying it?
Well, if we look at LEAF alone, I think that there are many jobs that will be connected to the conservation and restoration of forests. And so the go-to place that you just went to, which was, well, if we have laws, which most countries and states do, then we just need people to enforce them. Sure, you're going to need to hire rangers. You're going to probably need to buy or invest in drones, early detection system, possibly helicopters, to be able to go from point A to point B quickly, to be able to stop people. So yes, enforcement is obvious. You're going to need scientists to be able to quantify climate impacts and nature impacts. You're going to need investment in new resources and tools and people that know how to use them. The geospatial field is burgeoning. But here's some less obvious places that you might not think about. And that is operating at the jurisdictional level is going to require that many, many smallholder farmers are going to be required to be compensated, educated, right? Educate on how to do conservation well, how to do restoration well, educated on how to interact with simple systems that enable for them to be compensated.
Right.
How to incorporate agroforestry practices. And then we get into resources, saplings. If you're going to do restoration, you're going to need saplings. If you're going to install monitoring systems, you're going to need to, investments are going to need to be made in securing and then installing those systems. The list goes on. There are many different levers that jurisdictions will be pulling. And I think all of those levers are going to require additional human resource to make sure that they are pulled and are working.
Which provides a vision of an expanding economy, or at least expanding economic economy. We don't necessarily always need growth. But this also ultimately, and again, I know we have so much we can cover here, but let me ask the kind of final summarizing question. What's the long-term goal that you envision as the Leaf Coalition? Is it to rewild? Is it the 30 by 30 or half Earth project where we're dedicating either 30% or half of the planet to nature? What do we need to get to as a destination in order for there to be a long-term sustainable economy and healthy planet?
Well, it's a numbers-based question. So just coming back to the carbon budget, there's roughly 6 billion tons of forestry-related emissions pumped into the atmosphere every year. That needs to come down to just 1 billion tons in 7 years. So cutting down tropical forests, it needs to stop. It needs to stop fast. And this is where these incentives can play a critical role. And then there needs to be a massive restoration effort that sees, I don't remember the exact number, but I want to say that, the ability to sequester another 2 to 3 billion tons through forestry within the next 10 years. Don't quote me exactly on that number, but it's something big. And that's where you see projects or initiatives like the Trillion Trees Project come into the forefront. Both are needed. It's definitely not an either or. Both are needed. And I think that the beauty of the Art Trees credit and the Leaf Coalition is that the companies that my team and I have been able to convince to get involved are very keen to see that both take place, that conservation is upheld and that restoration begins. And that's where the mechanics of the Leaf Coalition enable that to happen, right? There's rules around how that can and should happen. For example, you can only begin to issue restoration type credits once you've stopped the destruction of your forests.
So how can our listeners learn more and get involved from their perspective?
I think that consumers can go to the leafcoalition.org website. They can read about what we've been able to achieve so far, what the initiative aims to, or the outcomes that it aims to achieve, who's in the coalition, right? Maybe these are companies that they already do business with.
Right.
And if they're really, curious about how else they might support as an individual, they can reach out to any of us at the Emergent. Well, emergentclimate.com is our website. And we're always happy to receive questions and thoughts and ideas about how else to amplify the work that we're doing.
Well, Allan, I do look forward to another conversation to dig deeper into this, but thank you very much for spending time with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
We've been speaking with Allan Traicoff, Chief Commercial Officer at Emergent, the nonprofit that directs the Leaf Coalition, which is a consortium of global companies and governments. You can learn more about Emergent at emergentclimate.com. That's no dash, no space, emergentclimate.com, and about the Leaf Coalition at leafcoalition.org. Leaf Coalition, again, no space, no dash, leafcoalition.org. The rapid progress by the Leaf Coalition, which has marshaled more than $1.5 billion in carbon project funding in less than 2 years, is inspiring. It also shows that, to some extent, society may have prepared itself to address the climate crisis. We have the infrastructure for collaboration necessary to connect funding and projects with the level of accountability and transparency necessary to inspire confidence that governments and corporations can work together effectively. Now, of course, consumers and the rest of us need to have clear line of sight visibility into what's going on so that we can choose to back the project, the companies, and the government efforts that are underway. We'll have Allan back on the show again in 2023 to discuss how the LEAF Coalition is evolving. I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this show or any of the more than 350 episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear with your friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers. And if you take a few minutes to give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform, that would be great. It'll help get the word out. You folks are the amplifiers that spread the ideas that lead to a less wasteful world. So let folks know they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. We appreciate your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We'll be back in the new year with another innovator interview. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.